and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant, and today we have a very special episode, the battle for the ages, Longsword versus Katana. A tale as old as, been around for a while at this point. A lot of people like talking about the Longsword versus the Katana, East versus West. Now, I am going to explore this concept in today's episode. I love both the Katana and Longsword, as you guys are well aware. Now, to be clear here, there is so many differences between these two different types and styles of swords. They're not even really in the same class, so actually a matchup like this doesn't make a lot of sense. There are plenty of swords that are far more comparable to the Katana of European origin versus like the Longsword, right? These are just completely different. Now, I should mention that I have tested and destroyed literally countless different swords, both katanas, traditionally folded katanas, differentially hardened katanas, Honsen-mai katanas, ranging from 200, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. Like, I have broken and tested a lot of katanas in my time at this point, and the same goes for long swords. So I come at this from kind of a couple of different perspectives. Now, in today's episode, I want to distill to get kind of the core of the issue between these two different blades. What I mean by that is I don't want to factor in any of the context, any of the historical aspects of it, because honestly, they don't matter. When we're comparing two different swords, we are comparing the objective realities between both of them. So with all that out of the way, let's get out there and start swinging these blades around, because the best way to evaluate the longsword and the katana is to start cutting with them. So these are our longsword and katana of choice for today's comparison video. Now, like I said, there is going to be an endless amount of caveats, because nothing I'm saying is definitive. Some things are subjective, and some things are going to be based on what you personally care and think is valuable versus what I do. Now, first thing we should mention is the price point. These are both from Romance of Men. Now, that's really important, is because the quality between both of them is pretty much identical, except one is a longsword and one is a katana. Now, there's also not going to be very much bias here, because this is my custom katana from Romance of Men that I made, meaning it's my favorite katana in the world. And this brand new longsword, I think like this is one of their new longsword lines, I am in love with. Now, the color, that's negotiable. We'll probably change that to a Tyrant thread a little bit later on. Just for an update, I've already done it. But relatively speaking, in terms of if you asked me to design the perfect longsword to my specifications that I actually had to use in combat, you would get this. You would get this sword 100%. It has a very, very slightly sweeping up crossguard. Funnily enough, I think that this is actually the Aragorn Ranger sword design. That's where it's gotten its inspiration from. And then we have a scent stopper faceted pommel, which is my personal favorite, combined with is it a hexagonal? Yeah, hexagonal handle, which is my favorite. So in terms of a longsword, this is my favorite configuration and style and design. And in terms of a katana, this is also my favorite style and design. So getting started with some of the main differences between something like a longsword or a katana, and that would obviously be the weight distribution, the mass, how it is distributed. For example, on our longsword, we have that nice pommel there. Now, what that pommel does is it means that that tip can become a little bit lighter in the hand, so it counteracts it kind of, right? So I'll show you the point of balance here. So God, that tip is rock steady. Oh, it has beautiful balancing. Anyway, but whereas with something like a katana, it obviously doesn't have a pommel. So the weight distribution on this is a little bit more in the blade for the chop, whereas this is a little bit more thrust-centric, but of course, it can still chop like a monster. Just little, very subtle differences. So if you were to ask me what's better between a katana or a longsword, I'd go, well, first off, it depends which longsword, because there's so many different types and blade geometries that can be completely different from one another. But at the same time, it also depends what you kind of prioritize. For example, katanas, they're not the best at thrusting. That doesn't mean you can't thrust with them. I have done it many a time, but it doesn't mean that they are the best at it. But a longsword is much more robust in the thrust. So for example, if I prioritize thrusts over chops, which personally I would a little bit, because in combat thrusts are far more deadly than chops, just as a general rule, that means that you would pick something like a longsword over something like a single-edged curved sword. So there's a lot of nuance in there where it's like, well, what do you prioritize? What do you prefer? Anyway, so let's start off with our katana. Because we said it is a little bit more of a cut-centric sword, right? A slash-centric sword. It means in the cut, it is fantastic. Not only is it fantastic, it's very beginner-friendly because of the blade geometry of a katana. Now, obviously, there are slight differences. There's different tips. There's a whole bunch of stuff. I know, we're just talking about the very stereotypical style katana geometry. It has a very steep bevel with a very fine edge. And what this acts is kind of like a wedge. It means that when you actually slice and cut things, because we also have that benefit of that weight distribution, it means that it cuts really well and it feels really good in the hand to cut with because of its construction method. So let's talk about the complete opposite construction methods of the katana and the longsword. Starting off with the katana, obviously we have our blade, and then a part of the blade that extends down into the handle is called the tang. This part here is the tang of the blade, same with the longsword. Now usually there's either 1 or 2 holes where bamboo pins will go through that actually hold the entire handle assembly together. So you slot on your tsuba, your habaki, all that sort of stuff, and then your handle, and put a small little bamboo pin through the handle, through the tang, holding it all together. Then we get to the longsword. So the longsword, obviously we have the blade and then usually a longer tang, because it extends all the way through to the end of the pommel. So we have our crossguard, we have our handle, and we have our pommel. These will all slot obviously over the blade, and then there'll be a slight little portion that usually sticks out of the pommel. This part will get heated and then hit down, actually capped down with a hammer, holding everything together. So it's held together by literally the sword itself. The actual material of the steel of the tang holds the entire construction of the handle and hilt together. Whereas with the katana, obviously it's held together by those bamboo pins. Completely opposite. So when you combine all of these aspects together, what you get is a very nice, absolutely beautiful sword to cut with and to slash with. And this makes it beginner friendly, meaning if you were to give it to somebody who's never cut before and you gave them a nice sharp katana and you say cut this and they cut it, they'll probably be able to cut it relatively easy and it will feel really nice. So if that's something that you prioritize, then that means you would lean a little bit more towards a katana. Like, feels so good. Don't clip that, you bastards. Anyway, what I'm saying is, it means that if you were to give somebody a katana who doesn't really know that much about swordsmanship, they're still going to be able to cut pretty well, honestly. So let's talk about what I would consider to be the most important aspect of this discussion, what actually I would say generates a lot of the discussion about it, and that is popular culture. Popular culture is by far the largest medium in which most people, the everyday people, the masses, interact with either the katana or the longsword, whether it's through anime, cartoons, movies, TV shows, gaming, manga, comic books, you name it. We're talking tens of millions of people from not only when they're kids all the way into their adult life. And this is where I feel like a lot of the actual skewing of information comes from, because obviously Japan has become a large cultural exporter over the last couple of decades, with things like, anime and manga becoming bigger than comic books, right? And obviously the main focus, not all the time, but most of the time, is around things like the katana being the greatest sword, being able to do all these crazy things, which is perfectly fine. Obviously it's made by Japanese creators, so of course it would. But there's also an additional dynamic here, because on the flip side, a lot of Western media actually portrays the longsword completely incorrect. They portray it as heavy, overbuilt, all these sorts of things, which it's not at all. And if we go even further, I feel like there's an extra layer here, and that is people that actually do interact with these sorts of blades who aren't actually in any sort of swordsmanship. For example, like at, let's say, Comic-Cons, or they buy them from malls, or from, just sort of those cheap places. You could buy like a $20 replica anime katana, and honestly, its weight and balancing would be pretty not bad. I don't recommend cutting with it. It's probably dangerous, probably a wall hanger, and could hurt you, but the weight on it would actually be rather fine. And the reason why is because, like I said a couple of times now, the construction method of a katana is actually fairly standardized and rather easy to get right. Whereas with the longsword, there is a lot more nuance, a lot more complex geometry to actually get the balancing and the weight correct. Case in point, if we look at Lord of the Rings, I would consider Lord of the Rings to be the most popular media in the world that depicts really, really good, like, European type sword design. For the movies, they were made by real bladesmiths, so the designs and the complexity of their geometries is actually really, really good. However, the official replicas are incredibly heavy, overbuilt, terrible swords. They actually have terrible weight, terrible handling. They're not actually made for, you know, combat or anything like that. They are purely wall hangers. And that's the most popular of all kind of European type fantasy swords that most people will interact with. So even if the best of the best, which is the Lord of the Rings stuff, the replicas on that, are incredibly overbuilt and not built like real swords. Whereas when you look at even the cheapest of anime katanas, knockoff $20 pieces of crap you get from the mall, and even they feel good, you kind of start to understand why there's such a disparity here and why a lot of people whose only interaction with this sort of subject matter is through, you know, popular culture, which is where the most people interact with it. You can start to see why people get a skewed view of these two incredibly complex weapons. And this doesn't just specifically apply to things like swords, right? This applies to a whole bunch of different things where popular culture can skew people's understanding of the real things. I think a perfect example of this is like Kung Fu, right? And bullshit, people watching Kung Fu movies and, you know, combat movies and all these things and thinking all these crazy moves are possible. A lot of people's interaction with this sort of stuff is purely based off fiction. You see what I'm saying? Like, katanas are just so fun to cut with. They are absolutely gorgeous and beautiful swords in the hand. They are fantastic, fantastic swords. That was nice. That was real nice. If we now switch over to the longsword and we talk a little bit about that. Well, usually your longsword is going to be obviously a straight blade. It also has two edges, one here and one here, primary and secondary edge. So this means that you can not only do primary strikes, but you can also come around and do secondary strikes, which opens up a very, like an entire realm of techniques that the katana just isn't really going to utilize because of its geometry and blade shape and design. Now, we did mention, obviously, the construction method of the katana is quite good. Like, I actually am a big fan of the construction method. It absorbs shock quite well, and it also means that it's quite repairable, because usually what breaks first is like the bamboo pins. Take them out, put some new ones in, so you can fix your katana if you break it, which more than likely you probably will if you're using it, very easily. Whereas something like a longsword, usually we have the tang running all the way through the blade, and then it is peened at the end. Now, this means that if anything becomes rattly or breaks, it's a little bit more complex and involved to fix. Not that you can't fix it, it's just more difficult, essentially. So like we said, when it comes to the longsword, there are different techniques that you can employ with it. For example, if I was to, like, let's just say we had a katana, right? We cut it like this using that primary edge. Whereas, for example, if I wanted to use my secondary edge on something like a longsword, then I can come around and cut it like that. It opens up a different realm, like different vectors of attack that your standard katana just isn't really going to take advantage of because of its inherent design and shape. If you're enjoying today's episode, you should really consider subscribing. I mean, I have a saw shield. I mean, I have a twin blade here. But if a twin blade isn't enough, I also have a trident. This is the type of content I do, along with giant swords and a whole host of other stuff. So if you like these sorts of things, you should consider subscribing. Now, something I should mention, like I said, there is a boatload of caveats in today's episode, but one of those things that I should mention is obviously this katana is quite a bit shorter than a longsword, but keep in mind there are other swords which are far more equivalent in terms of their length to a longsword. So I'm just using what I've gotten from Romance of Men as like a very standard, modern, mass-manufactured size katana. I should mention that both of these swords are really nice. I've been enjoying them. All right, let's cut a bottle. Oh, that's fucking nice, bro. If you want to pick up one of these swords, either of them. Now, you're not going to be able to get one that's exactly the same as this because I did a lot of custom stuff to it. But if you want the same blade, which is the Spring Steel Romance of Men double fuller one with the same wrap and ray skin combination, I love their stuff. They're the ones who sent me my full samurai set, which was fantastic. I've tested a bunch of their katanas, absolutely destroyed them. I love this longsword for starters, and obviously this has been my favorite katana since I finished building it. So if you want to pick up either one of these, there'll be a link in the description. I recommend either of them. If you want a nice, cheap, but quality either katana for cutting or anything, these things are incredibly strong. And now, if you want one of their long swords, which they've started making, I think this one is called the Dragon Whisperer or something like that. I have been thoroughly impressed and happy with it so far. So I recommend this one as well. That's so good, holy shit. This is very rapidly becoming one of my most favorite long swords that I own, straight up. Oh, I like this long sword. All right. I'm not biased. It's just this is a brand new sword and I'm enjoying it. Don't worry, we'll get back to the katana in a second. Let me have this, damn it. Edge geometries, blade shapes and profiles, weight distribution, vibration nodes. There's other things like the sharpness of the blade and what the blade is actually used for. There's just an endless list of reasons why the katana and the longsword are so different to cut with. And one of the ones that's really important, I think, is also the heat treating and tempering, right? Now, obviously these ones are both spring steel swords to keep them consistent, but the flex on a longsword is quite different to a katana. So this can actually make it a lot harder to actually cut with, because obviously that flex and that vibration means that when you're actually trying to cut through different mediums, it can make it a little bit harder, especially if you've never used one before. So that's where that beginner friendliness comes in with the katana in terms of cutting. Next up, hand protection, Tsuba versus crossguard. Which is more protective? Now there is the caveat that obviously historical Tsubas were larger than these modern mass manufactured ones, but the dynamics at play here will still be pretty much the same. Starting off with the Tsuba, the biggest issues we have with it is that it's just not very protective. It's very easy for the blade to slip off and obviously hit your hand. Now your hand is one of those most common targets in swordsmanship, because obviously it is most presented forward to your opponent, making it easy to hit. Then we have the added issue that steel is slippery and usually it can bounce. And the problem is that there's nothing really here on a Tsuba, whether it's this size or larger, there's nothing really here to trap the blade and stop it from sliding off. Then when we switch over to the crossguard on the longsword, this is far more protective, and you're probably wondering, well, how is that? Because it's not protecting your hands. Engaging the crossguard on something like a longsword is incredibly easy. Not only is it incredibly easy, it's actually a lot more protective, because the crossguard is obviously way longer than a Tsuba, and the more that you rotate it, the more protection you get all the way around your hands. It's essentially a cross-section of a circle, right? Think of it that way. So if a strike comes in and it's all the way out here, the quillions on your crossguard are not only going to catch it, but they're actually going to funnel it down to the strong of your blade. This part of your sword is called the strong because obviously you have more leverage because it's closer to your hands. So not only can the crossguard be used for defense, it can also be used to bind your opponent's blade and used for offense. So for example, let's do a thrust. Absolutely gorgeous. Obviously he's just wearing the gambeson, so obviously both swords are going to be able to blast through this like there's no tomorrow. So if we go for that thrust, gorgeous. I hit the core. Remember, this is my favorite katana. I wasn't just saying that for camera. I don't want to f up my tip, for sake. Anyway, let's do a slash as well. Let's open up this gambeson a little bit. Absolutely Ooh, look at that. That's what I'm talking about. Nice little easy slash. That wasn't even a hard slash. All right, longsword. Thrusting, same sort of thing. I haven't actually thrust with this sword, so I don't know. Oh, I barely put anything into that one. That was, it's as if not, there's nothing there. There is absolutely nothing there. There is nothing there. Oh. I think that was a little bit harder. To be fair, I think I hit it just a little touch harder, and I think that is borne out by that. But yeah, a very similar performance, you know? So now we take everything that we've spoken about in today's episode and we apply it to a points list, hopefully deciding which one is the best sword. So the categories that I've come up with is comfort, construction, versatility, thrusting, cutting, speed, protection, skill requirement, and the strength of the blades themselves. Starting off with comfort, in my mind, there's a clear victor in this category, and that is the katana. I love longsword handles, but the problem is there's so many different bloody types. And for example, like I'm not a big fan of wire wraps. There's just a lot of different handle types, and it's really hard to come up with kind of the most basic bare bones one. But the truth is, I've handled a lot of longswords that were uncomfortable. I have never in my life handled a katana that I thought was uncomfortable. So in my opinion, the katana takes this category. Next up, construction. This one's complicated because honestly, I don't think that there's a winner. The reason why is they're polar opposites from one another. How can you decide which one is better when they're just so different? And honestly, this just comes down to what you prefer in your construction method. Obviously, having the peen at the end of the tang means that this is a much more sturdy construction, but it means that it's a little bit difficult to repair, like I said earlier. Whereas the katana is a little bit weaker and it's easier to break, but it's also a little bit easier to fix. There honestly is no objective answer here. This one is purely subjective, and it's what you prefer, so I think we'll give them both a point for this one. Next up, thrusting. The katana's great at thrusting. It has a very stiff blade. Even this one here, you know, we said we're not talking about the differentially hardened blades or anything like that. Katanas are just usually stiffer. And even this spring steel one, they're both spring steel, this katana here is a stiffer blade, where this one is a little bit more flexible, meaning in the thrust, it is perfectly reasonable. But the longsword is just better at thrusting. It's made for thrusting. It has a very, double-edged, sharp point that is in line with the hilt. It's just a better thrusting sword overall. That doesn't mean you can't thrust with the katana. Just means the longsword's better. So we'll go for a point with the longsword for this category. Next up, versatility. Like, I have to go with the longsword here. I really just don't understand how you could choose anything else. I mean, when you have two edges, obviously it opens up more techniques, but then also combining that with the crossguard and the pommel, it also opens up other techniques. Like, every single part of the longsword can be used either defensively or offensively, whereas the katana just falls a bit short in some of these categories. Again, doesn't mean it's bad, it just means in terms of a versatile weapon, it's literally what the longsword is. It's made to be really good at everything. Not the best, but really good at everything. So I think the point goes for versatility to the longsword. Next up, cutting. The longsword cuts beautifully, fantastically, and there are so many different types of longswords, like I mentioned earlier, that have different blade geometries and shapes that are absolutely incredible, and perhaps even sometimes better than the katana. But again, we're just talking about the very general stereotypical longsword versus katana, and in this category, the katana just cuts better. That doesn't mean the longsword can't cut, it doesn't mean it's not beautiful at it, it just means in this particular category, on average, the katana not only feels better in the cut, but also feels like it has a bit more, oomph behind it because of obviously the weight distribution of it. So the point goes to the katana for this one. Next up, speed. Honestly, this is, again, subjective. Both of these blades weigh about the same on average, right? There are a lot more blades out there that are faster, and like a saber, or a rapier, things like that, where they just are more nimble, honestly. But both of these swords are kind of equivalent in terms of their speed, if we want to put it that way. But the truth is, it really just comes down to how fast you are, not your blade in this category. So I'll give them both a point for speed. Next up, protection, defense. We spoke about this. Like, the crossguard is a very generalized purpose, effective, both defensive and offensive item. Hand protection really just goes to the longsword in this category. That doesn't mean the Tsuba is the worst thing in the world. Like, I am really happy to have a Tsuba that stops your hand slipping on the blade. Like, I've, held a lot of swords and cut with a lot of swords that don't have any guard at all, and I hate them. So having a Tsuba that does somewhat offer some protection while also, stopping your hand slipping onto the blade is still good. But generally speaking, the crossguard is just superior. Next up, we get into skill requirement. I'm going to give the katana this category. The reason why, like I said throughout today's episode, is because of the stiffness of the blade, because of the comfort of the handle, because it has, a long bevel with a rather fine edge. It means that if you don't really know how to use a sword, you can pick up a katana and just use it kind of off the bat. It's a cheat code. It lets you do things that with a longsword will punish you for. For example, getting that edge alignment, perfect, getting that thrust perfectly aligned. Things like that are difficult and take, practice and skill. Whereas with a katana, they're just a little bit easier to do because of the inherent design of the blade. So for the skill requirement, I would actually give it to the katana. And then last but not least, we get into the strength of the blades. Look, we've removed the context, because if this was on, differentially hardened blades or folded blades or any of those sorts of things, the longsword would win, because I've tested all those blades and they're not very strong, honestly. The longsword is probably going to win in this category anyway, because, like we said right at the beginning, the construction methods are so different, but in terms of strength of a blade, not only do you have that primary edge where if you take a massive gouge out of it, you smash it or whatever it is, you have a second one. So not only in that regard, the strength of the blade is good, because if it gets damaged, you can still use it. Whereas when it comes to the construction method of the tang, the crossguard, all that sort of stuff, it also allows it to be far stronger, because damaging a blade like this, or completely destroying a longsword, is really difficult. Destroying katanas, honestly, it's a little bit easier. So in this category, we just got to give it to the longsword. But with that being said, that means that the longsword comes out on top ever so slightly over the katana in this particular ranking. Because what I prioritize in my sword is to be an effective and deadly weapon, and having two edges is better than one, because if one gets damaged, guess what? You can use the other one. And that's what the longsword is. I feel like this is really important. The longsword is a fantastic, versatile weapon that isn't the best at anything, but it's really, really good at a lot of things. Like I said, the katana is better at slashing and cutting, but the longsword is really good at slashing and cutting. When it comes to thrusting, is it the best thrusting sword in the world? No, but it's really good at thrusting. That's what the longsword is. It's a very general purpose weapon, and that's what makes it so versatile. And to me, having a versatile weapon that in any situation can be relied upon, that's why to me it is a better weapon compared to the katana. Now, does that mean the katana is bad? No, it just means that this matchup, longsword versus katana, isn't really what I would put the katana up against. I'd put it up against something like a Kriegsmesser. That's much more of a realistic and fair kind of comparison. This is kind of a weird matchup that doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you want my opinion, the longsword is more versatile as a sword and as a weapon, so therefore I do think it is better. But if you prioritize different things, then maybe the katana is better for you. That's what this is about. A sword is a very personal item, and whether or not a sword is good or bad really depends on you. And even then, there's the huge caveat and context that could nullify literally everything that I've said in today's episode, and that is how good you are with it. If you're shit with a sword, it doesn't matter what sword you have, you're shit with a sword. But if you get better with a sword, then these little nuances and these little things that I've brought up, having that secondary edge, maybe those things will make a difference to you. But the skill of the user is far more important than your sword type. But discounting all of that, the longsword does have the edge over the katana because of some objective things that I would say. But then again, My objective reasoning is I want a more versatile weapon that's better as a weapon. I'm not really sure how you could judge a sword or a weapon in any other way, but if you do, then perhaps you prioritize something else. But that's going to be all. Thank you guys for watching. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe, leave a comment down below, and as always, I'll see you next week in another episode.